So let's go ahead and take out our Bibles, and if you have an electronic device like your phone or something like that, we have a digital version of the Bible. Please follow along with us this evening as we dive into God's Word. And where I want us to kind of start as a little bit of the background of what we just read in our Gospel reading. We pick that up in Matthew chapter 16. And it says here that Jesus took Peter and two brothers, James and John, and he led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. And Peter blurted out, "Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a bright light, a bright cloud came over them. And a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." The disciples were terrified, and they fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over, touched them. He said, "Get up, don't be afraid." And when they looked, they saw only Jesus. This experience they had with Jesus was pivotal, even though they didn't really know it at the time. They didn't understand the significance of that.
No? Hey, it worked though.
Yeah, I know.
You don't know the secret, but I do. No, it worked. You got my attention. And so, as we take a look at this passage this evening, and we recognize that this was a very significant moment in Jesus' ministry, because it really marks the beginning of the end of his ministry and the beginning of his suffering and his death. As he sets his face toward Jerusalem, Jesus knows exactly what's coming his way. He knows what to expect. This is what he came into the world for. This is what we celebrate at Christmas time, really, is Jesus running the race and Jesus fulfilling the task that was before him. We often talk about mountaintop experiences to kind of describe maybe a really significant event in our lives. And it might have been something, a spiritual a point in our life where we just came to this realization, or God just opened something up to us, and we feel just as high as a kite, and we're just way up here, practically in the clouds, and we're just so excited, and the feeling is, I'll never feel low, and I'll never feel down again, and that's how we feel in the moment. But the reality is, for every mountain you go up, you got to come back down. And even Jesus knew that. And this was a mountaintop experience. And this was the first of 3 mountaintops that we're going to be looking at during Lent. And tonight's the one where we take a look at the Transfiguration. So Mount Transfiguration, that's the first point on our outline. Mount Transfiguration is our first mountain. And then next week, we're going to be launching into another sermon series. But when we come back to Holy Week, we're going to hit the other 2 mountains. And that is Mount Olive and Mount Calvary. And we'll kind of come back to what we're looking at this evening. So Mount Transfiguration is our first mountain. And the disciples were excited about this. They saw Jesus in his glory. But look at what's happening here. And if we take a look at Luke's gospel in chapter 9, it tells us something a little different than what we read about here in Matthew's gospel. And that is this, that the disciples were sleeping. These must have been the narcolepsy boys. No, it really wasn't that. It's just that the pace of Jesus' ministry was significant. And Jesus was always on the move, and he was always driving forward because he knew where he needed to be. He knew when he needed to be there. And there were times, too, where the pressures of ministry would surround him, and then Jesus would go off with his disciples to a quiet place. And there he would pray, he would regather, he'd regroup. And he was teaching his disciples that you can't be 100% going all the time. You've got to take some time to step back, to recenter yourself, refocus yourself on where God is leading you and where God is guiding you. Otherwise, you're gonna end up in trouble. And that principle that he teaches them, he teaches to us too. And it's so important for us to have times where we're just all in for God. That's always. But we also have to take those times to step back and to regroup and to get some rest and some relaxation for what may come next. The disciples were so excited about what they'd just seen. They'd seen Jesus in his glory. And it was such a powerful glory that they really couldn't even look at him. This is what the Bible calls the glory of God. It's in Hebrew, the word is Shekinah. It's the Shekinah of God, the glory of God. It's the kind of glory that emanates from God. It's different than the sunlight. It's different than the stars. It's different than any kind of created light. In fact, we could say that the stars and the sun are representations of the Shekinah of God. It's maybe in one way God reminding us of his light, the physical light that we're able to see. But the Shekinah, the glory of God, is something very different. And they're seeing Jesus surrounded in this glory. And they recognize that there are two people from the Old Testament stories. One is Moses, and we just got done reading about Moses. And what it tells us here is that Moses, when he died, no one knows where Moses was buried because he was with God when he died. And God took care of all of that. But we also have another person. We had kind of a special transition from this world to the next, and that is Elijah. Elijah didn't die a physical death, but instead his protege, Elisha, was able to see Elijah going up to heaven in a fiery chariot. It's interesting that these two people that died sort of under these really kind of miraculous circumstances, they're the ones that come to speak to Jesus. But it's also significant because Moses represents the law. In other words, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that'll be significant in just a second, I'll get there. But he represents the law. But Elijah represents the prophets, all the prophets of the Old Testament. And in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish Bible, and in the Jewish thinking, that's what the Bible for them is divided into, the law and the prophets. So it's significant, these two key figures representing law and the prophets are here to do something for Jesus. Now, one of the things that Matthew doesn't talk about as to what is going on during this meeting with Moses and with Elijah, but Luke does pick it up, and that is that Moses and Elijah are preparing Jesus about his exodus from the world. I think the Father sends them there as support, to encourage him, and to give him that extra strength, because Jesus, even though he's the Son of God, he's also a human being. He's born as one of us, and he too has to struggle with many of the things that we do as human beings. Although he's without sin, that doesn't mean that he doesn't struggle on our behalf and wrestle with a lot of things in his life. Satan tries to tempt Jesus and tries to drive him off point. We see this all the way up to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Satan's working on Jesus so hard to get him to walk away from the cross. And we see Jesus himself in his humanity calling out to the Father, "Father, is there some other way we could do this? Could we talk? Could we discuss this? Could we maybe come up with another way? But your will be done." And he places himself under his Father's authority, and he submits to him. And we talked about that just a couple of weeks ago. He becomes a servant, not only to his Father's will, but to you. He becomes a servant to all humanity. And that's where the real glory is at. What the disciples see is they see the Shekinah of God, and they think of the glory of pomp, and the glory of when everything's going right, and the trumpets are blaring, and everyone's singing, and everyone's shouting, and everyone's dancing, and everyone's praising God. That's what they see as glory, and that's certainly part of it. But the glory that we see at the cross is the glory of Jesus submitting to the Father's will to rescue us. That's where the real glory resides, in Jesus humbling himself, becoming our servant. Jesus was encouraged, and this is our next point on the outline. Jesus was encouraged for the fiery trial ahead. That's what Moses and Elijah were doing. The next place we're going to be looking at is Matthew 17, verse 3. Moses and Elijah, as we said, represent how the Jewish people looked at what we call now the Old Testament. They didn't call it the Old Testament. It was just, they called it the law and the prophets. And they were encouraging Jesus for what lays ahead and what they, as God's prophets, had foreseen and predicted that the Son of God would do. Moses was very clear with the people of God, or the people of Israel. He said, God's going to raise up a prophet among you like me. You need to listen to him. And now, almost 1,200, 1,500 years later, the prophet of God arises, and for the most part, God's people reject him. God's people don't see him as who he is. But they're there to encourage Jesus to stay the course. And that has a lot of implication in our lives. That as we go forward, there are going to be times where we're going to maybe feel let down. We're going to feel that we're struggling with something. And maybe God is not going to take that struggle out of our way. Maybe the only way through this is to come down off the mountain and go through those dark valleys. And not knowing what's on the other side. But when you go down a valley, what's the only way you can go after you hit the bottom of the valley? Back up again. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's when we're in the high places that we can see a long way. When you're on the mountaintop, you can see mountains and mountains and mountains, and you can see the valleys. But when you get down the valleys, you can see only what's just around you. And isn't that just like life? Where we get stuck in places and we just wonder, how is this going to work out? How is God going to lead me? How is God going to guide me? And to you, Elijah and Moses and Jesus say, stay the course. Follow me. Follow my path. You'll be all right. Trust in me. Here's what it says in Matthew 17, verse 3. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared and they began talking with Jesus. And what a comfort and what an encouragement that must have been. And as we said, they're preparing Jesus for what lies ahead. He knows it, but they're there to encourage him, to speak into his heart and into his life so that he can take those next steps. Can you imagine how difficult this really must have been for Jesus? He knows exactly what's coming. He knows it. And so his Father, because he loves him so much, sends these two very special people into Jesus' life at this moment. Men who had followed God even when it was difficult. Followed God when people rejected and turned their back on them. They become an example, even for Jesus. Stay the course. As Jesus goes through this experience, it's when the disciples wake up and they're seeing the glory of God all around. And you know how it is when you wake up suddenly out of maybe a really good sleep. And again, don't be too tough on the disciples. This mountain of Transfiguration, I don't know how many of you have been to the Holy Land. I've never been there, but I've seen enough pictures of the Holy Land to know that you've got some really steep climbing on a lot of these mountains, okay? Now, I know me, if I had to climb up first of all, I probably wouldn't make it to the top. Let's just be honest, probably wouldn't make it. But these guys were a little bit younger, plus this was part of their culture where they lived, their geography, they were used to it, but still, it's a huge climb. And they get up there, and you know how it is after you've done something where you've exerted a lot of physical energy and you're just sitting for a while. What is most likely to happen? You're going to start getting tired. It's kind of like when pastor just keeps preaching and preaching, and you're sitting in that very comfortable, Pew. Have you ever noticed how it always just feels so good? Oh, if I could just slip away right now. And when you're at home in bed, it never comes that easy. Do you ever notice that? I don't know why that is. It's just a reality. And so you're sitting there and you say, I really want to listen to it. I'm going to give you credit. I really want to listen, but man, I'm just so, this is feeling pretty good. And the next thing, your wife is nailing you in the ribs and, not there, honey. That's the rib that you took out of me. Maybe that's why God took that rib out, to get in there and wake up. So don't be too hard on them, because I think for most of us, we would find that we were overcome. And in that moment, it's not just the physical exhaustion, but also recognize this, that Satan leverages those moments. He uses our own weaknesses and just physical weakness. I'm just talking about something physical, like climbing and doing all this, and you're tired, and all of a sudden you're extra tired. Like with that tiredness, if I could just go to sleep right now. You know what I'm talking about, right? Well, you do right now. And, it's like, oh man, I could just so easily, And a lot of times, especially in spiritual situations, Satan is working on that and giving you that stupor. So when you've been sleeping and you've been suddenly woken, you're disoriented, right? You ever just sometimes wake up, oh, wow, where am I? Where am I? Well, that's kind of what's going on here. And that's a normal wake up. Now, these guys aren't getting a normal wake up. They're waking up, and all of a sudden, here's Jesus as they've never seen him before. And here are two people that somehow they know, either Jesus tells them after the fact who it was, but Peter seems to know who these guys are. But he sees them, they see the glory of God, and their senses are overwhelmed, and so they just start blabbering. They just can't get their minds around what's happening. And suddenly they're just prattling on, and Peter's like, I'll build you. I'll build something. Jesus, I'll build something. Well, Jesus is a carpenter. Jesus can build whatever he wants, right? I'm going to build something. I'll build some memorial booths here. Man, this would be great. Maybe later we can have people come back here and we can charge them to see where Moses and Elijah. I'm just kidding. But he's thinking about them. He's wanting to honor them. He is. But he's so disoriented. And it's at this time that this cloud rolls in. And if you've ever been on a high mountain somewhere, and it's been like a kind of a sunny day, and a cloud comes in. I remember thinking as a kid, look up on those mountains, and wow, I wonder what it's like to be in the cloud. And then when you're older and you're actually there, it's no different than being in fog, is it? It just comes in and you really can't see very far. It's wet, it's drippy, and it's in all of this. And then this big booming voice, the Father saying, this is my Son. Listen to him. I'm pleased with him. Listen to him. And then it all rolls back away, and they're terrified. They're on the ground in terror because they've come into God's presence, and they're overwhelmed. They're undone. And look what happens. Jesus goes to each of them, goes to them, and tells them to get up. And Matthew puts it this way, and I love it. And when they looked up, all they saw was Jesus. So that when you look up after you've been knocked down, maybe you've had this great mountaintop experience, or maybe you're down in the valley, whatever that might be, look up. Because Jesus is there with you. You never travel these paths alone, even if it feels like it. And we highlight faith over fear and faith over feelings. That whether you feel it or not, Jesus made a promise to each of us. I am with you always. And always means always, forever. So that even though you feel alone, you are not. You might be in this moment thinking, I feel pretty alone. This is going on in my life. This isn't going right. Or something is happening here. And I feel alone. I've been calling out to God. I've been praying to God. I've been asking God, God, please help me here. And it's just like my prayers are bouncing off the sky and coming right back at me. I'll bet most of you have had that kind of experience. And if you haven't, you will. Because it's all part of being a Christ follower. It's for God using that moment to teach us and to grow us, to mature us, to look beyond our feelings, and to trust and believe. Whether I feel it or not, whether I see it or not, believe it. Believe God is here in this moment. They looked up, and all they saw was Jesus. Our last point on the outline is this. Coming down from the mountain, Jesus, and here's the blank that we fill in, prepared his disciples. As he's coming down, he's telling them, I don't want you talking to people about this right now. And we're going to be looking at Matthew 17, verse 9. And we might ask ourselves, why wouldn't Jesus want people to know this? It's because Jesus already knew that people were going to see what they wanted to see, they were going to hear what they wanted to hear, and they would keep trying to push Jesus into a position that Jesus wasn't going to be pushed into. Ever notice that with the crowds? Whether Jesus wanted to be king or not, they were going to, by force, make him a king. And so Jesus, using that divine power that he has, is able to just sort of melt into the crowd. And, whoa, where did he go? What happened to him? See, Jesus won't be put into our molds. And when we try to do that with him, he's always going to break out of it. And he needs to. He must do that for our own sakes, so that we realize God is bigger than what we can ever imagine. And sometimes that's challenging for us, because when he becomes bigger than what we ever imagined, or he works in ways we'd never anticipated, and sometimes those ways might be painful and hurtful and sacrificial, it may cause us to step back and say, God, what's going on here? And that's the time where you really got to hang in there and say, no, I know he's here. I know he's walking with me. He prepares his disciples, tells them not to tell anybody about it, because he knows what the crowds will do with this information. They won't see him as the Son of God. They will see him as the warrior king they wanted to believe in. They were willing to sacrifice their spiritual welfare for just a human kingdom. They wanted an earthly king. They didn't want a heavenly king. And Jesus knew this. This is why he told them, mum's the word, guys. Not until after I come back from the dead. And the disciples always hated when Jesus started talking about coming back from the dead, because that sounded to them like failure, like something bad was going to happen to Jesus, and nothing bad can happen to Jesus. That's what they thought. That's what they were thinking. And Jesus had to demonstrate, even though it was hurtful to them, even though it was painful for them. This was a close... They were friends, not just disciples. But he had to demonstrate that even with me, things can happen. And you need to trust that I've got all of this under control. Here's what it says in Matthew 17:9. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. They didn't make much of this at this point, because every other time when they walked with Jesus, he had so corrected them, and many times very sharply, I want you guys to knock this off. I am going to suffer and to die. Remember, Peter was correcting Jesus. Lord, you'll never be treated this way. And that's when Jesus says those harsh words, not so much to Peter, but to the attitude that Peter was exhibiting. And that is, get behind me, Satan. Because in a sense, in that moment, Satan was using Peter to tempt Jesus to become that worldly king. And Jesus said, you're a roadblock to me. You're an obstacle to me. He wasn't beating on Peter. He was just saying, Peter, you're being used. You're being played right now. And you need to knock this off. And that's a pretty harsh rebuke. And the other disciples heard it, and they knew this is one we're just, we'll think what we think. We just won't say anything. He reminds them again of what lays before him and the glory that doesn't look like glory. A cross, a death, final words of it is finished. And that's where the glory lies, in Jesus' obedience and in Jesus fulfilling the purpose and plan for which his Father had for him. All God's people said, amen.